The longest-lived money in human history was not the pound, not the dollar, and not gold bullion. It was a single coin the size of your thumbnail. It weighed about 4.5 grams. It was struck from nearly pure gold. And for roughly 700 years, it did not change. Think about that number for a moment. 7 centuries. Merchants in England took it. Traders in India took it. It turned up in the markets of China. And in every one of those places, nobody had to trust the emperor who minted it. They only had to trust the coin, because the coin was always the same. The economic historian Robert Lopez gave it a nickname that stuck. He called it the dollar of the Middle Ages. And then, in about 40 years, it lost 2/3 of its gold. Here is the part that should stop you cold. When that collapse began, this empire had not been invaded. No enemy was inside the walls. The most trusted money that has ever existed was not murdered by a foreign army. It was taken apart, deliberately, by the people who made it one emergency at a time. And when it finally died, one rival quietly got rich. This is the autopsy of the solidus, and the 4 things that kept it alive for 700 years are the same 4 things economists are watching on the dollar right now. Let's start with what a sound coin actually is, because the whole story turns on it. The solidus was created by the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, somewhere around the year 309 to 312. The design was almost boringly simple. You took a Roman pound of gold, and you struck exactly 72 coins from it. Each one came out to roughly 4.5 grams of near pure gold, about 24 carat. In Greek, they called it the nomisma. In Western Europe, they called it the bezant, after the city that made it, Byzantium. There is a trick that governments have used for 2,000 years to rob their own people without anyone voting for it. It is called debasement. You take the coin, you quietly melt in some cheaper metal, copper, silver, and you stamp the exact same face on it and hand it back at the exact same value. The coin looks identical, it spends identical, but there is less gold inside. The difference goes into the treasury. It is a tax nobody agreed to, hidden inside money everybody uses. For the solidus, that almost never happened. For 700 years, emperors were overthrown, blinded, poisoned, and replaced, and the coin stayed 24 carat. We know this in almost obsessive detail because of numismatists like Philip Grierson and Silly Morrison, who spent careers weighing and assaying these coins. The record is astonishingly flat, a straight line, century after century. And then the line breaks. Under the Emperor Constantine IX, in the middle of the 11th century, the gold content slips to about 21 carat. A small thing, barely noticeable, but it does not stop. Under Constantine X, about 18 carat. Under Romanos IV, 16, under Michael VII, 14, and by the reign of Nikephoros III, around 1080, the coin that had been near pure gold for 700 years was down to roughly 8 carat. 33%, 2/3 of the gold, gone, in about 40 years. Today we do not clip metal out of coins. We do not have to. Debasement now wears a different costume, the printing press, the deficit, the balance sheet that goes from billions to trillions. The act is identical. The tool is just cleaner. But that leaves the real question. Why would the richest court in the world start poisoning its own money after 700 years of discipline? The answer is a battlefield most people have never heard of. To get there, we first have to understand what that coin was standing on. And the first thing holding it up was a rule that nobody was allowed to break. The first pillar under the solidus was discipline. A single rule, treated as sacred. You do not touch the weight, and you do not touch the purity. Ever. This sounds almost too simple to matter. It was everything. Because that rigid, unchanging standard is exactly what let a coin travel 3 continents. A merchant in Alexandria selling silk to a merchant from Venice did not need to know whether the current emperor was strong or weak, generous or broke. He did not need to read the politics of a court 1,000 miles away. He needed to know one thing. Is this a solidus? If yes, then it is 4.5 grams of gold. Because it has always been 4.5 grams of gold. The trust was not in the ruler. The trust was in the rule. That is the whole secret Lopez was pointing at with that nickname. A reserve currency is not strong because it is powerful. It is strong because it is predictable. Now hold that thought against the dollar. Because the dollar had exactly this pillar, and we can date the day it changed. In 1944, at a resort called Bretton Woods, the United States built the modern financial system on a promise. The dollar would be the anchor of the world, and the dollar itself would be convertible to gold, at $35 an ounce. That was the American version of the sacred rule. The dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. On the 15th of August 1971, President Nixon went on television and cut that link. Economists call it the Nixon shock. The convertibility to gold was suspended, and it never came back. In a single afternoon, the rule that made the dollar as good as gold was gone. I want to be careful here, though, because this channel does not deal in panic. The dollar did not collapse in 1971. It is still standing more than 50 years later. But the point is not collapse. The point is the pillar. The solidus was disciplined for 700 years. The dollar's discipline was severed in one press conference. Those are simply not the same foundation. If you find this kind of pattern useful, the kind your financial advisor will never walk you through, take a second and subscribe, because the next 3 pillars are where it gets uncomfortable. Because discipline alone did not make the solidus strong. A rule is just a promise. Behind that promise stood something real. And that is Pillar 2. The second pillar was the engine, a real productive economy standing behind the coin. Gold does not create itself, and a mint cannot conjure wealth out of a stamp. The solidus was backed by the single richest asset the empire owned, Anatolia. Modern-day Turkey. It was the breadbasket. It grew the food, it raised the soldiers, and above all, it paid the taxes. The wealth that flowed out of Anatolia was the real economy that the coin was a claim on. The gold in the coin was just the receipt. Anatolia was the thing you were actually holding. And on the 26th of August, 1071, the empire lost it. At a place called Manzikert, in the far east of Anatolia, the Byzantine army met the Seljuk Turks and was shattered. It was not just a defeat. The emperor himself, Romanos IV, was captured on the battlefield. That had almost never happened in the empire's history. And in the chaos that followed, the disaster compounded. Instead of uniting, the Byzantines tore into a series of civil wars over the throne. While they fought each other, Turkish groups moved into the undefended interior. Within roughly a decade, most of Anatolia, the breadbasket, the tax base, the recruiting ground, was simply gone. Go back and look at the debasement timeline now, and the whole thing snaps into focus. The sharp collapse of the coin from 16 carat to 14, down to 8, happens in the exact reigns that follow Manzikert. That is not a coincidence. Numismatists like Silly Morrison, who reconstructed the coin's decline gram by gram, read this fall not as greed, but as fiscal desperation. The emperors were debasing because the real economy that stood behind the coin had been ripped away, and they still had armies to pay and a court to feed. Lose the engine, and the coin has nothing left to be a receipt for. That is the lesson underneath all the numbers. A currency is a shadow that a real economy casts on the wall. It looks solid, but shrink the thing casting the shadow, and the shadow shrinks with it no matter what the coin says on its face. The modern mirror is quieter and slower, but it rhymes. A reserve currency is, in the end, a claim on a productive economy. When the productive base narrows, when the debt grows faster than the output behind it, the foundation under the money gets thinner, even while the coin still looks exactly the same. The solidus still said 24 carat on the day it was 8. So the money had discipline, and it had a real engine. Why did the entire known world still line up to hold it? That is pillar 3, and it is the one the dollar is losing right now, and unlike the Middle Ages, we can actually measure it. The third pillar was trust, and trust, at this scale, is a network effect. The solidus was accepted from England to India to China for a reason that feeds on itself. Everyone accepted it, because everyone else accepted it. Once a coin becomes the thing every merchant will take, holding it is not a bet on one empire, it is access to the entire network of trade. That universal acceptance was the solidus's true superpower. It is precisely what Lopez meant by the dollar of the Middle Ages. Not that it was pretty, that it was everywhere, and everywhere it was trusted. Here is why this pillar matters most for us. It is the one we can put hard numbers on today. According to the IMF's own reserve data, the US dollar today makes up roughly 57% of the world's allocated foreign exchange reserves. That is still dominant, nothing else is close. But in late 2024, that figure hit about 57.4%, the lowest it had been since around 1994. Step back, and the trend is clearer, across roughly a decade, from 2015 to 2024. The dollar's share of global reserves fell about 8.5 percentage points. Not a crash. A drift. A slow leak. Now look at where the air is going. In 2024, the world's central banks bought more than 1,000 tons of gold, a record pace, and the third straight year above that mark. A World Gold Council survey of those same central banks found that around 70% of them plan to increase their gold holdings over the next 5 years. Gold is now roughly 20% of global central bank reserves. That makes it the second largest reserve asset on Earth, behind only the dollar. And it is not just gold. Russia has reported that around 90% of its trade inside the BRICS bloc now settles in national currencies, not dollars. I want to keep this honest, because a skeptical audience is the only audience worth having. There is no BRICS supercurrency about to dethrone the dollar tomorrow. Even the countries pushing hardest have no concrete plan for one. This is not a collapse. It is erosion. But erosion is exactly how the solidus lost its trust, too. Quietly, in small steps. The coin was still trusted right up until the year it wasn't. So there are three pillars: discipline, a real engine, and trust. Lose any one of them, and you are fragile. But Byzantium did not simply lose these pillars to bad luck. It did a fourth thing on purpose, and that fourth thing is the one reason the coin actually died. This is the answer to the question we opened with. The solidus did not fall to an invading army. It fell to a signature. Meet Alexios I of the Komnenos family, who took the throne in 1081, an empire bleeding from Manzikert, broke, and now facing a new threat, the Normans, attacking by sea. Alexios needed a fleet, and he did not have one, so he went to the one power that did, the Merchant Republic of Venice. And around the year 1082, scholars still argue whether it was 1082 or a decade later. So let's say around 1082, Alexios signed a document called a crucible, a golden bull. In exchange for Venetian ships, he handed the Venetians a deal that is genuinely breathtaking in hindsight. He exempted Venetian merchants from the commercion, the empire's standard customs duty, of around 10% across his territory. And he gave them their own permanent quarter, with wharves, right on the harbour of Constantinople itself. Sit with what that means. The Byzantine merchant, the empire's own citizen, now had to pay a 10% tax that his Venetian competitor, standing at the next dock, did not. He was undercut in his own city, by his own government's decree. Over the following decades, tax-free Venetian traders, and then the Genoese, came to dominate the empire's trade routes. And every deal they won tax-free was commercial revenue the empire no longer collected. Alexios had not just borrowed a navy, he had signed away the future income that stood behind his own coin. Then, in 1092, he tried to fix the money. He scrapped the ruined numisma entirely and minted a new gold coin. The hyperpyron, the name means super refined. And it was better, about 4.5 grams again, but at 20.5 carat. Look closely at that number though, 20.5, not 24. Even the Great Reform, the honest reset, never restored the original standard. The best they could do was a permanently lower bar. And the leak never really sealed. In the coinage record Philip Grierson catalogued, the hyperpyron slid too over the next 2 centuries to about 18 carat, then 15, then 12 by the early 1300s. In 1204, soldiers of the Fourth Crusade fellow Christians sacked Constantinople itself. The empire that had minted the world's most trusted coin was now a target to be looted. This is the part that closes the loop, and it is the most important idea in this entire video. When a reserve currency dies, the demand for a trustworthy coin does not die with it. That demand moves. It goes looking for whoever is still keeping their money honest. And in 1284, the Republic of Venice, the same Venice that had bled Byzantium tax-free for 2 centuries, minted its own gold coin, the ducat, about 3.5 grams of near pure gold. And the ducat quietly inherited the exact job the solidus had held, the trusted trade coin of the Mediterranean world. The crown did not vanish. It passed to the power that refused to debase. If you take one thing from this channel, let it be that. Reserve status is not destroyed. It is transferred to whoever keeps their coin honest. Subscribe, because that single idea is the thread running through every collapse we study. So let's put the whole autopsy back together on the table. The solidus lasted 700 years because it stood on 4 pillars. Discipline, a rule about weight and purity that no emperor was allowed to break. An engine, the real, productive wealth of Anatolia standing behind it. Trust, the network effect of a coin that everyone took, because everyone took it. And restraint, the refusal to debase, even when times were hard. It had all 4 for 7 centuries. And it lost all 4 in about 40 years. Not to an invasion. To a lost battle it could not absorb, and to a series of emergency decisions: debase the coin to pay the bills, sign away the commerce to buy a navy, each one reasonable in the moment, and fatal in sequence. Hold the dollar up against those same 4 pillars now. Honestly, the discipline, the gold anchor, was cut in 1971. The trust is still enormous, but it is measurably drifting, from about 66% of reserves a decade ago toward 57% today. The engine runs on ever larger deficits, and the successor is already being minted not by a rival empire, this time, but by the world's own central banks, quietly stacking gold until it is 1/5 of everything they hold. I am not telling you to sell everything and run. That is not what this pattern says. What it says is quieter and, honestly, more useful. Currencies almost never die by murder. They die by self-inflicted wounds, taken during emergencies, that feel necessary at the time, slowly, then all at once. The solidus is a 700-year receipt. It proves, beyond argument, that sound money can last for centuries. And it proves, just as clearly, exactly how a government throws that away. History already ran this experiment for us. The only real question is whether we read the results before we repeat them. Subscribe, and let's keep reading them together.